Nations. My father's name was Starling, MACK Nations, and in the calendar year 1961, my father, through countless personal interviews as well as written correspondence with killer Richard Eugene Hickok, wrote a manuscript called High Road to Hell. The purpose of me putting this video together, as simple as it can be, is to do this, is to tell people a story that's never been told before, so that a record of that story has been presented to the public about the creation of Truman Capote's in quote, out quote, masterpiece in cold blood, and how that story came to be, and how my father and his attempt to write High Road to Hell was never published, actually was never even talked about. And I would like to leave a record while I'm still alive of what I found out about this entire account, and I hope that it will be of benefit. That would be my reason for doing this. I'd like to read some quotes taken from Too Brief a Treat, The Letters of Truman Capote, edited by Gerald Clark, author of Capote, A Biography. Page 309, to Alvin and Marie Dewey, from Truman Capote, from Verbier, Switzerland, January 16, 1961. Have started work again on the book. I have contracts for it with 7 foreign publishers: England, France, Italy, Spain, German, Poland, Japan. So all the Deweys, including Pete, are going to be world famous. I think you'll like yourselves in the book. You're awfully nice, but I'm not so sure others will be too pleased. End of quote. Second quote, pages 331 to 332, to Alvin and Marie Dewey, Verbier, Switzerland, November 21st, 1961. However, I wanted at once to thank dear Alvin for sending me that extraordinarily vulgar magazine containing the preposterous HICKOCK Nation's contribution. Dear God, and to think I was worried about Mr. Nations. However, some few details are interesting from my point of view. Also, it is obvious that this article has been cut out of a much longer manuscript. I would certainly be interested to see the original HICKOCK manuscript before Nations tampered with it. Third quote, page 326, to Alvin and Marie Dewey, Palamos, August 16th, 1961. While we were on the subject, Marie, do you remember telling me that the first time you ever heard of Hickok and Smith was when Alvin came home one night and showed you their mug shots, the ones with the vital statistics on the back? Well, I want to do this as a scene between you and Alvin. Can you remember anything more about it? Not that I mind inventing details, as you will see. Also, can Alvin send me the statistics that were on the back of the photographs? Bless you both. Page 339, to Alvin and Marie Dewey, Hotel Continental, Paris, 20th of February, 1962. I was amazed by the clippings about Lee Andrews I thought it would be another few months before we got around to that again. Please send word as soon as you know it could have great bearing on Hickok and Smith. P.S. Yes, in going back to 70 Willow Street, it is being repainted now. But find a nice cabin for me in Colorado, and I will buy it, and you can use it. I mean it. Page 342, to Alvin and Marie Dewey, Revere, Switzerland, 29th of February, 1962. Dear Hearts, was much amused by Marie's letter today, especially the MACK Nations news. Do tell me more. Is it serious? Will he go to jail? I certainly hope so. Now why can't they get Shyster Schultz on the same deal? He's a tax dodger. You can bet your bottom dollar. Page 343, to Bennett Cerf. Revere, 4th of March, 1962. Cher B. Was happy to have your sweet note from Palm Springs. However, do hope the weather improved. First off, some Kansas news. It is now quite definite that the Kansas Supreme Court will reject the appeal for a new trial. The hearing was a fiasco as far as Smith and Hickok are concerned. I understand their lawyer never intended appealing directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. Isn't it absurd? Oh yes, one very amusing item. Remember Matt Nations, the newspaper bastard who has caused me so much trouble? The one who said Random House was publishing his book. He has been arrested for income tax evasion. To Alvin and Marie Dewey, page 382, Revere, Switzerland, 15th of February, 1963. P.S. I just sent part 3 of the book to Mr. Sean last week. He cabled me. A masterpiece. Stop. A work of art. People will be reading 200 years from today. So see, you're not only going to be famous, but immortal. And that's no joke. Page 403 to 404, to Alvin and Marie Dewey, Bridgehampton, New York, Tuesday, July 28, 1964. Dear Hearts, I've just finished talking with Clifford H. about this Bobby Rupp business. Billy Wagner is very anxious to have him sign the release and has been putting a great deal of pressure on me about it. If Alvin were to speak to Bobby and tell him that he has read the manuscript and that it is very nice about Bobby, which God knows it is, and contains nothing that could possibly embarrass him, perhaps Bobby could be persuaded to stop being adolescent. However, there may be reasons why Alvin would not want to do this. However, if Alvin is willing, please call Cliff. He will give you 2 releases. One is the original release, and the other is something special. Bobby told Cliff that he had no objection to his character and personality being used in the film as long as he wasn't identified by name. The second release is a compromise on that basis and could be offered if he balked at signing the first and original release. I hate to ask such a troublesome favor, but alas, it has become important. These quotes are from Mockingbird, a portrait of Harper Lee by Charles Shields, pages 270 to 271. Nell's conflicted feelings about writing the past and the invasiveness of publicity came to a head in 1988 with the publication of Gerald Clark's best-selling Capote, a biography. Reminiscing to Clark about growing up next door to the Lees, Capote claimed that Mrs. Lee had twice tried to drown 2-year-old Nell in the bathtub. Both times Nell was saved by one of her older sisters, said Truman. When they talk about Southern grotesque, they're not kidding. Nell was outraged. There was no more vulnerable or painful side of her life he could have touched on. She wrote to Caldwell Delaney, an old friend and former director of the Museum of Mobile. Truman's vicious lie that my mother was mentally unbalanced and tried to kill me, that gentle soul's reward for having loved him, was the first example of his legacy to his friends. Truman left in the book something hateful and untrue about every one of them, which more than anything should tell you what was plain to us for more than the last 15 years of his life. He was paranoid to a terrifying degree. Drugs and alcohol did not cause his insanity. They were the result of it. Clark's rejoinder was that everything Capote told me is in the book as closely as I could relate it. He declined to say whether he had ever verified the drowning incident. End quote. Quote from Mockingbird, A Portrait of Harper Lee by Charles Shields, pages 160 to 161. Years later, Dewey insisted Capote got the official word on developments at the press conferences along with everyone else. Some people thought then, and probably still do, that he got next to me and got in on every move of the law. That was not so. He was on his own to get the material for his story or book. That's the way things were when the good news finally came on December 30th. Marie backed him up. Alvin refused to talk about the case. We just visited, that's all. Our friendship developed in that way, but the investigation wasn't talked about. But Nell's notes about everything that was said and done that night in the Dewey's home tell a different story. The Associated Press and United Press International broke the news of the arrest the next day. KBI Director Logan Sanford had been struggling to keep the investigation under wraps until the last possible moment. A few days earlier, he had met privately with a reporter whose hunches about the suspects' names and motives were correct. Sanford asked the reporter to hold his story until Smith and Hickok were in custody. Otherwise, they would be tipped off before KBI agents could nab them. In exchange for the favor, Sanford promised he would later share everything the Bureau had on the case. The reporter said he would wait. When the gentleman's agreement with Sanford came to light, his newspaper fired him. These are the books that my little video made for the public are concerning. This is an original copy, a paperback copy of In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. And as you can see, there are many tabs within that book. Each one of them is a tab that I put in there concerning things that I found in the personal correspondence from Richard Eugene Hickok in the letters he wrote my dad from the, I'd say, early spring of 1961 until the fall around October of 1961. Now, the letters that I have privy to, I still have 4 original letters written by Hickok in death row to my father when he worked for the Wichita Eagle and Beacon newspaper in Kansas. My father was a senior editor of that newspaper and also a reporter. He had been a lifelong newspaper man his whole life. He went into the Navy in the fall of 1941 before Pearl Harbor and was discharged in, I believe it was September of 1945 after the war had ended. All those years prior to that, he worked at newspapers, and until his death on December 24th of 1968, he continued to be a newspaper man. Too Brief a Treat, The Letters of Truman Capote, edited by Gerald Clark, is another one of the books that I used in my research because they contain quotes from where I read from earlier, especially about my own father in this book. I feel like because they're in there, I have the right to respond to them as well. And I feel like I have the right to respond to this book. My father isn't here. This book was written many years after my father's death without him having the opportunity to respond or defend himself or say anything about what was being said about him. So I have kept quiet about this for a very long time, but I'm not going to keep quiet about it anymore because I don't need to. This book is called Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, A Critical Handbook, and it was edited by a professor in New York City named Irving Malin, the City College of New York. It came out in 1968, I believe, the same year that my father died. It's out of print, but it contains many valuable individual articles in here concerning the writing of In Cold Blood. These were by contemporaries of Truman Capote, and for the large part are very valuable in what they reflect at the time that they were written, in consideration of the story that Truman Capote said was based on his own investigation and solely on his own notes and interviews done with the 2 killers, Perry Smith and Richard Eugene Hickok. Inside this particular book, you will find the magazine article that was published in December of 1961 in Mail magazine in its full. This was a reference to Truman Capote back here on one of the quotes that I read earlier. It had been cut out of the entire High Road to Hell manuscript, and my dad was able to have that published, sold it to that small magazine in New York back in the fall of 1961, and that's what remains of his book, High Road to Hell. It was missing the last time I saw it. There were people that know about this that are still alive They read it. It was in his possession in Colorado in 1968 and was laying on the newspaper desk there at the office of the Werfeno World, based in Walsenburg, Colorado, the day that my brother and I left Colorado to drive to Kansas and spend Christmas there with my mother for 1968. It was the last time I ever saw my father. It was the last time I ever saw his book. I have inquired about it as best I can to people that would have probably had some idea of where its whereabouts ended up. Inside the manuscript, on every typewritten page, were the initials of Richard E. Hickok. They were up there on every page. The manuscript I have been unable to locate. My mother tried to find it. My brother Mac, before he died, tried to find it, and we just have not been able to locate it, so I consider it lost. But in saying that, what I do have is over 200 pages of the original letters that Hickok wrote to my father in the spring to summer to early fall 1961. Actually, they're not exclusive to those dates, but that's when they were written. The copies that I have, over 200 pages worth, were in the calendar months of May and June of 1961. They are inclusive of Dick Hickok's account of the Clutter murders and the events that both he and Smith took prior to the killings, when Smith traveled from out west to come to Kansas and meet Hickok in Kansas City. Their actual going out to Holcomb, Kansas, what happened inside the house that night, what happened after they left the house that night. They came back up to Edgerton, Kansas, and they were there for about a week, and then they left Kansas and made their way all the way down to Old Mexico, and all of this is documented in the letters that I have donated to the Kansas Historical Society in Topeka, Kansas. There's something I would like to say about both the stories communicated by what Truman Capote said. Most of the story was written based on his conversations and intimate relationship with Perry Edward Smith, and that's fine. He talked to Hickok. He didn't like Hickok, and I think the reason, or one of the biggest reasons that perhaps that existed, was that Dick Hickok had given my father the original story of this entire matter prior to Dick Hickok ever talking to Capote, which didn't happen until January of 1962, well after High Road to Hell had been finished, and was in the process of trying to find a publisher for that book before Truman Capote ever went to Lansing, Kansas to interview either one of the killers. Nell Harper Lee and Truman Capote, through the cooperation of KBI agent and lead investigator Alvin Dewey, in January of 1960, while the investigation was still going on into what had happened before the trial in March of 1960, granted Truman Capote and Harper Lee 2 interviews with Hickok and Smith in his own office in Garden City, Kansas, while the 2 were under arrest and were being held prisoner in the Garden City, Kansas jail. Nobody else got that. None of the local papers, the Kansas papers that asked to interview them or see them were granted that. Only Truman Capote and Harper Lee were granted that, and it was granted by Alvin Dewey, the lead investigator. The last book that I would like to hold up is Mockingbird. It was written by Charles Shields. It is an outstanding and interesting book as far as the in-depth investigation by Mr. Shields on Harper Lee, and there is an extensive chapter on her involvement with Truman Capote in the writing and the discovery of the information, what they teamed up to do, and their time together that they spent out there in Garden City, Kansas, trying to put together facts from people that lived out there about what happened that night in Holcomb, Kansas, to the Clutter family. It's a very, very well written book, and I have talked to Mr. Shields and communicated with him in writing a couple of different times. Appreciated very much his time, but this is a very worthwhile book to read. In 2012, in November, I made a long promise trip to myself up to the Kansas Historical Society after finding out that they had in their possession the prison files of Richard Hickcock and Perry Smith in their possession. In the archive department up there, in the restricted area, you can view those files. They used to not be online. They have put them online, which I think is a very good thing for people to access if they have interest in the subject. I don't know if they'll really understand what they're looking at or not, but I went up there in November of 2012 to review both of the files, and I made copies of almost 100 pages from the Hickok file. Perry Smith, when my dad went to the penitentiary in the winter of 1961 as a reporter for the Wichita Eagle and Beacon, did not want to talk to my dad, and so my dad didn't talk to Perry Smith. He saw Perry Smith, and his reaction was this. Perry Smith, according to my father, was the type of individual that you might have over after church on a Sunday afternoon to have dinner with your family, and after dinner was over, Perry Smith would murder your entire family. Richard Hickcock, my father met at the same time and wrote about in the newspaper, and Richard Hickcock told my father that he was interested in writing his life story, and Richard Hickcock said that he made arrangements with Tracy Hand the warden of Kansas State Penitentiary up there in Lansing, Kansas, to allow MACK nations to come into the institution to visit with him firsthand and be able to interview him on a basis where it could work out to where he would apparently notify the prison that he was coming up there, and then they would go ahead and allow him to come in. Now, this is where this story of mine starts to fit in. When I went up there in November 2012, there is no record, no visitation log of MACK nations anywhere in that file that he ever talked to Richard Eugene Hickok, that he ever visited KSP in Lansing. It's absurd. It really struck me sideways, if you will, after I discovered that. And I thought to myself, why is there no record of my father going into a maximum security penitentiary to visit with a death row inmate of the magnitude of Hickok and Smith? Because that murder, those murders out there in Holcomb, Kansas, are still regarded probably as one of the very most severe crimes ever committed within that state. To this day, there's a tremendous interest in that crime and what happened, and trying to research it or learn about it, and that is primarily why I'm doing this video. This is my own expose called Inside My Father's Shoes. I wrote it and I got done with it in September of 2013. The letters from Hickok to my father I transcribed within the pages of the expose, and there's much of the documentation that I found inside Hickok and Smith's file, also copyrighted inside my own expose. It is not available, it has not been published, but I did copyright my story in February of 2014. I wanted to prevent anyone from trying to use my father's name or his story or the letters that were written to him that belonged to him only from profiting from my dad's work. They'd already done that, and this is going to be something I'll dive into concerning Truman Capote's masterpiece in Cold Blood. I think you'll be shocked at the similarities, if not downright plagiarism, involved in the practices of the writing of In Cold Blood. We'll take a break now.